and welcome to our first lecture of the week. And now that we're through the Second World War, we're going to begin talking about the Cold War. So today, in this lecture, we're going to be making our way from the end of World War II up through the Vietnam War. And then in our second lecture, we're going to talk about the social movements of the 1960s, not just in the US, but Europe as well. Now, as you know, World War II was the most destructive war in human history. It cost millions of military and civilian lives, ultimately causing 3 times the death toll of the First World War. With the exception of the United States, which was unreachable by enemy aircraft, all combatant nations suffered widespread destruction. World War II also ushered in the nuclear age. Yet during World War II, the foundations of the world as we now know it were laid. You have the organizing of the United Nations, which was built off the faulty League of Nations system, and they tried to make it better. But as I mentioned when we finished World War II, 1945 was a year of both hope that the war's end might result in a better world, but it was also a year of grim assessment as the full extent of the global damage of the war was finally being tallied. And out of the ashes of World War II immediately come the Cold War, which will result in half a century of tension between capitalism/democracy and communism. Now, as the world rebuilt, the United States and the Soviets, as I'm sure many of you know, will come to loggerheads over their 2 different systems of government. But I have this quote here from Winston Churchill that he gave the year after the war ended in Switzerland. And he says, "What is the plight to which Europe has been reduced? Over wide areas, a vast quivering mass of tormented, hungry, careworn, and bewildered human beings gape at the ruins of their cities and homes and scan the dark horizons for the approach of some new peril, tyranny, or terror. Among the victors there is a babble of jarring voices, among the vanquished a sullen silence of despair." So this is the world, and here are some pictures to drive in. This is what Europe looks like. This is what much of Japan looks like. Many parts of the world are just completely decimated. In this picture, you can see the destroyed bridge in the background. All these buildings have been bombed out. Again, another picture of just the rubble. So again, yes, people are happy the war's over, but it's not like things automatically get better all of a sudden. People are waiting for the other shoe to drop. They're waiting for the next terrible thing. And as the tensions between the US and the Soviets become very evident, pretty much immediately, people are now afraid that the US and the Soviet Union are going to go to war. Now, the United States, as I mentioned before, is one of the only nations to come out of World War II doing fairly well. The economy is bustling due to the war, but also the United States has not sustained damage on its own soil, again, with the exception of Pearl Harbor. The Soviet Union, while it did endure a great deal of damage, as I mentioned last week, Russia is large, and there are lots of people, and they're able to sort of about face their economy fairly quickly after the war. So starting in 1945, for the next 45 years, the United States and the Soviets will be locked in a prolonged struggle to determine whether capitalism or communism is the best system. This is an ideological war in many ways. The problems that other people have with communism were evident when we talked about the Russian Revolution and also when we talked about Hitler and the Nazis. So if you need to refresh, I would suggest going back to those lectures. But the short version is that communism took direct issue with capitalism, arguing that capitalism was the reason why so many people are unhappy in the world and that communism fixes that. Capitalists in democracies argued that communism was the problem. So each side sees the other as the root of all evil, basically, and as a poor system for government. Now, both the US and the Soviets will engage in what are called proxy wars, rather than ever directly fighting each other. The Soviets never line up against the United States and go to war, but we will fight wars against communism just through other countries. So we'll talk about the Korean War as well as the Vietnam War, both of which are the US and the Soviets are fighting each other indirectly. Now, the United States will pursue a policy of what's known as containment. They can't change the fact that the Soviet Union is communist, but their foreign policy for the rest of the 20th century will be to try to contain communism to the Soviet Union. Now, does this work? Well, that depends on who you ask. But we will see China become communist in 1949. You have Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea. So you do have quite a few countries that will become communist despite this US policy. Now, there are several events that led to this clash between the US and the Soviets. During World War II, the Allies were skeptical of Stalin's intentions in Eastern Europe. They were worried during the last 2 years of World War II that Stalin wanted to extend the communist revolution into Eastern Europe. And the Allies were not on board with that. And they were quite right to be skeptical. That's exactly what Stalin intended and then did. And the Allies were really concerned that they'd be exchanging one dictator, Hitler, for another, Stalin. The United States and Western Europe go on to form NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and they formed this in response to the first successful nuclear test by the Soviets in 1949. This was what they considered to be a defensive alliance against any perceived takeover by the Soviets. And the Soviets responded by forming the Warsaw Pact in 1955, which had the same purpose but for Soviet bloc nations. So because the Soviet army had invaded Eastern Europe, then going all the way to Berlin, as you know from last week, they did keep control of those countries. They put into power communist Soviet sympathetic governments. And so again, the Allies were right to be concerned about Stalin's intentions in Eastern Europe. And all these states that are in red here, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, become known as Soviet satellite states. Now, the reason why the Soviets do this is they see this as an opportunity to advance their ideas, to sort of export communism in the hope that these other countries will love it and it'll be kind of a sort of throwing up the middle finger to the Allies of saying, look, communism's so great, we don't know what you're so upset about. And Stalin's ideas about this are encapsulated in this quote where he said, whoever occupies a territory also imposes on it his own social system. Everyone imposes his own system as far as his army can reach. It cannot be otherwise. So he saw this as sort of a natural result of war, that, well, if you occupy it, you get to impose upon it what you will. And so he does impose communism on these countries. Now, in terms of the United States occupation, the Allies all divide up Germany because they're concerned about German power resuming. And so the eastern half of Germany becomes a Soviet satellite state supported by the Soviets. And the western half of Germany is initially divided up between the French, the Americans, and the British. But eventually it's really just an American holding, although the US, we will have bases there, we still do to this day, but the US will not necessarily stick around for as long as the Soviets stick around in East Germany. Now, in the capital of Berlin, Berlin is in East Germany. The Allies couldn't really agree on Berlin. The US and the British and the French did not like the idea that the capital city would be in East Germany, entirely controlled by the Soviets. So they divide the city of Berlin. So West Berlin is controlled by the Allies, sort of this pocket within East Germany. And then East Berlin is controlled by the East Berlin government, which is, again, a communist state. So West Germany, because it's controlled by the other Allies, becomes a democracy. So Germany becomes this kind of dividing line in Europe between communist Europe in the East and democratic capitalist Europe in the West. And the hope here for the US is to keep as much of Europe as democracies, as friends of the United States as possible, because it's clear that they're fighting this ideological war already. Now, even the first couple years after World War II, you have some confrontations between the US and the Soviets. Year after the war, US President Harry Truman makes what is now known as the Truman Doctrine speech, wherein he proclaims that the United States will support, quote, all free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure. And this was seen by the Soviets as a direct challenge, and that's exactly what it was intended to be. The Truman Doctrine will guide American foreign policy up through the end of the Cold War in 1991, that the US will support militarily, financially, etc., any nation that was resisting communist takeover. And that will explain how we get involved in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and so many other conflagrations of the late 20th century. Now, following this up, the U.S. launched the Marshall Plan, which was a federal aid program to help nations who had been destroyed in the wake of the war. All European nations had to do for this money, well, I shouldn't just say European, because China applied for the money, Japan applied for the money. If you sustained destruction during the war, you could apply for this money. So all you had to do was give full financial disclosure to the United States so that the people who ran the Marshall Plan could decide how much money you needed. So this was a plan intended to rebuild the economies as well as the spirits, especially of Europe, but of other countries as well. And the argument here was that, if we just leave these countries in tatters and destroyed, that leaves them wide open to a communist takeover. So if we help them rebuild, maybe they will sort of be fonder of the United States and they will remain democracies. So there is an end game here, but I would still argue this is one of the best pieces of American foreign policy that has ever been enacted. The Marshall Plan did not require repayment. This is not a loan, because the concern was if you force these countries to repay this, they may never get out of the whole of World War II. Most of these countries had lost all their money in the war. So the thinking was, if you don't make them repay it, they can get on their feet, be part of the economic global system again, much faster, again, and be on the side of the US in the Cold War. There were also no restrictions on the use of the money. So countries could use it to rebuild infrastructure, railroads, housing, whatever you needed. And that's honestly what most countries used it for, because as you saw in the picture, not a lot of housing, not a lot of transportation. The United States gave $13 billion between 1947 and 1952. That is a staggering amount of money. And that shows you how well the U.S. economy did during the war. That we were able to give away that amount of money and it didn't cause irreparable damage to the American economy at all. Now, anyone who sustained damage during the war was eligible. That means the Soviet Union and the Soviet satellite states were eligible. But Stalin did not want to hand over the financial information for the Soviet Union to the US because the Soviet Union had a rough go in the war and he didn't want the US to know how bad the economy had been hurt. He also forbade any of the Soviet satellite states from applying for Marshall Plan money. And what that means is that rebuilding Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union will take decades longer than it takes in Western Europe because of the money that they are not allowed to ask for. Here's a great map that shows you kind of, in Europe anyways, how roughly who's getting more money. But you can see this money is going a lot of places. As you can see, France and Britain get a lot. Again, both sustained heavy damage during the war, as did Italy. But here again, you can see the Soviet bloc nations, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, etc., they don't get anything because they're not allowed to ask for it. Now, Stalin will ratchet up the Cold War after China becomes communist in 1949, and in 1949, the Soviets also successfully tapped their nuclear technology, so he's feeling pretty powerful. Stalin endorses an invasion by North Korea into South Korea. At this point, Korea was not separated into two nations, it was just one nation. 75,000 soldiers of the communist North Korean government, backed by both the Soviets and communist China, invaded the southern democratic region in Korea. In June 1950, large numbers of communist troops crossed over into South Korea in an attempt to force the South to also be communist. South Korean troops fought a desperate rearguard action at the southern end of the peninsula in the attempts to push the northern Korean troops back. The United Nations branded North Korea as the aggressor, entitling South Korea to United Nations assistance. American troops were then sent to assist the South Korean troops because of the policy of containment, right? Trying to keep communism bottled up to where it already was. Now, neither the US nor the Soviets wanted nuclear war. Both had nuclear technology, but everybody understood after Hiroshima and Nagasaki that using these is really a last resort. Just the long-term impact, still no one really knew how bad it would be yet. Now, for 3 years, the war seesawed back and forth over the old border of the 38th parallel while negotiations dragged on. Neither the US nor the Soviet backers wanted to expand the war. Again, they didn't want to try out nuclear technology, so this is fought very similar to the way World War II was fought. But finally, an armistice was agreed upon in 1953. The armistice has endured ever since that point, but there has never been an official peace treaty to the Korean War. So technically, the Korean War is not over in that regard. But the boundary between North and South was drawn at the 38th parallel, which is where it still is today, and they created a 2-mile wide demilitarized zone, which still also exists today. For more than half a century, the border between the two Koreas has remained a volatile flashpoint. And, I mean, you can't go very many days anymore without hearing some news about North Korea, and this is where all of that starts. Now, the casualties for the Korean War are staggering, as you can see. 5 million soldiers and civilian deaths. 40,000 of those deaths were American soldiers. So most of the casualties in this war are North and South Koreans, and honestly, most of them are civilians. Now, the pressures of the early years of the Cold War, of Korea, of all these things, do kind of leak out in the United States. And one of the most famous ways they do that is in what's now known as McCarthyism. So amid the general anti-communism of the 1950s in the US, Senator Joseph McCarthy, a Republican from Wisconsin, rose to prominence in 1950 when he announced that he had this super secret list of members of the Communist Party that were employed in the US State Department. Now, McCarthy's going to pull this secret list thing over and over again, and no one ever sees the list. So he basically makes it up as he goes along, but people totally believe him because they're so scared about sort of communists everywhere. He creates the House Committee on Un-American Activities, and he will drag, for 4 years, he'll drag government employees, officials, Hollywood stars, musicians into this committee and accuse them of being secret communists. I mean, at one point he accuses President Dwight D. Eisenhower of being a communist, which is absolutely nuts because, I mean, Dwight D. Eisenhower was a 4-star general. He was the supreme Allied commander of the Second World War. I mean, this is an outlandish accusation with utterly no proof, and it didn't go anywhere, but again, McCarthy was kind of really out to get anyone. He dragged in, as I said, Hollywood stars like Lucille Ball from I Love Lucy was drug in. The entire Rat Pack, like Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, were all drug in. For some people, it ruined their careers, just the mere accusation of this. And I said it lasts for 4 years. Finally, people had had enough, and his constituency in Wisconsin did not re-elect him in 1954, and he kind of faded into obscurity. But this left a legacy of bitterness in American politics. It was seen as a modern-day witch hunt. He was looking for communists where they never found any. They absolutely never found any. Now, that's not to say that there weren't communist spies in the U.S. They absolutely did exist, just like American spies existed in the Soviet Union. But McCarthy never found them because he was looking in all the wrong places, honestly. Despite American dedication to containing communism, it continued to spread. And in 1959, Fidel Castro, a nationalist guerrilla fighter opposed to the influence of American companies in Cuba, succeeded in taking control of Cuba. He was a trained lawyer. He was the son of a Spanish immigrant who had become a very wealthy planter. 6 months after taking power, Cuba became this glowing symbol of communism for the Soviet Union. The Soviets sent huge amounts of money to Fidel to help him protect his new communist state. And Castro publicly endorsed communism in 1960. Now, to counter this, especially since Cuba is just right off the coast of Florida, President Dwight Eisenhower and the head of the CIA secretly supported and trained anti-communist dissidents in the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. In Latin America, a group of anti-communists trained in Guatemala with the sole intention of eventually overthrowing Castro. And again, that's an American-funded program. Now, President John F. Kennedy succeeds Dwight Eisenhower as president, and JFK will be the one to sanction an invasion of Cuba by seemingly independent freedom fighters that were not to be directly connected to the U.S. Armed Forces, even though they were. This is now known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, which took place in April of 1961. It's named for the small bay in southern Cuba where this invasion force landed. But they were promptly intercepted by Castro's forces, easily defeated, and this is probably the largest embarrassment of Kennedy's administration, because everybody knew that this had been funded by the United States. And so Castro's mad, the Soviet Union are mad, how dare you invade an independent country? Kind of an argument. Now, in response to this failed invasion, the Soviets agreed to Castro's request to put some missiles in Cuba aimed at the U.S. to keep the U.S. from interfering in Cuba's politics again. And this eventually led to the Cuban Missile Crisis in the fall of 1962, which was a tense 13-day period where people around the world really held their breath, wondering if nuclear war was going to destroy the planet, because the fear was that, would the Soviets launch on the U.S.? If the Soviets launch on the U.S., then the U.S. will retaliate, and it will just be this never-ending, again, world-ending war. This is the closest that the Cold War ever came to becoming a nuclear war. Ultimately, after 13 days, an agreement was made by Kennedy and the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. The Soviets agreed to remove the ballistic missiles and take them back to Russia, and the U.S. promised to never again try to invade or sponsor an invasion of Cuba. It also resulted in the creation of a direct phone line between Moscow and Washington, D.C., so that in the future they could sort out these things talking rather than maybe coming to the brink of nuclear war. Now, fortunately for the United States, even though they'd endured quite a bit of embarrassment with the Bay of Pigs, the Soviets also had their own embarrassments of the period. East Germany, still under communist control, pressured Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev to close a loophole in Berlin. So basically, what happened in Berlin is because the city of Berlin was also divided in half, as you can see on the map, a lot of people, artists, musicians, lawyers, professors, doctors, engineers, did not want to be in Eastern Europe. They wanted to be in the West where there was more career opportunity. And so what a lot of people would do is they would get to East Berlin and then they would sneak across the border into West Berlin, which the United States was totally on board with. Then they would get West Berlin passports, which would allow them to either go to West Germany or to Western Europe or even the United States. And so about 3 million people between 1945 and 1961 had left. 3 million people had left. This is hugely embarrassing to the Soviets. It's known as the brain drain because these are the best and the brightest, the most creative people are leaving. And this is really embarrassing because the Soviets are are out there saying, but we're the best and our system's the best and people love us. And Well, it's really hard to argue that when 3 million people are leaving, right? So they decide to build the Berlin Wall. And this ends up being a wall that runs through the city of Berlin, right on the border of East and West Berlin. Very expensive. And rather than trying to keep people out, the wall is trying to keep people in. It's trying to keep the people of Eastern Europe and East Berlin in, rather than letting them escape to West Berlin. It's not just a wall, though. It is heavily patrolled, as you can see in the bottom picture. There would have been tanks. If you were caught trying to cross the wall, you would be shot on sight. People will go to enormous lengths to escape. They'll build false bottom cars, all kinds of things to try to leave the communist region of Europe. And essentially, East Germany becomes a prison from which it's very hard to leave. And if you talk to people who lived through any part of this period, they'll talk about the Berlin Wall because it becomes such a symbol. It's a literal, physical symbol of the division of Europe into East and West, into Soviet, not Soviet. And so it's, again, really embarrassing for Khrushchev and the Soviets that they feel like they have to build this wall to keep people in. Now you also have a war of technology going on between the two countries. By 1950, both nations both had nuclear technology, so they both kept trying to develop the next big military advantage. In 1957, the Soviets announced the development of the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBMs, that had a range of 3,500 miles, which made it capable of reaching America's east coast, so kind of terrifying. In the same year, the Soviets launched the world's first orbiting satellite, nicknamed Sputnik. Now, as you can see, the US is not far behind on developing ICBMs, and that's why I'm putting all these dates up here, is to show you sort of this domino effect of one gets something, the other one gets it. 1957, Soviets launched Sputnik. 1958, the US launches their first satellite. So again, this back and forth. And as you can see, the Soviets are really ahead of the United States for a very long time. In 1961, the Soviets launched their first cosmonaut, which is the same thing as an astronaut, first launched into space. They followed that 2 years later by launching the world's first woman into space, long before the US will put a woman in space. And it's at that point that the United States becomes really, really dedicated to being the first ones to put people on the moon. And in 1969, they are successful. The United States successfully lands Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon, which is the picture there. And that is when Neil Armstrong makes his famous statement, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. This is a very, very big deal. People sat around their TVs watching this. This was seen as a huge sort of win for the United States that we got to the moon first. But there's a lot of money going into this. There's a lot of money going into NASA, into the Soviet space program, all because they want to know how they can use this technology to be better than the other, to force the other side into submission. So now we come to the Vietnam War. Now this war, you could teach an entire class on Vietnam, but we do not have time for that. But if you are interested in this, I know that Professor Moore teaches a class on the Vietnam War. So if you're interested in this, keep an eye out for his class. Now the Vietnam War is a lot like Korea. It's a proxy war between the US and the Soviets. A war where they don't directly fight each other, but they're fighting each other through other countries. Now, from the 19th century up through 1954, Vietnam was ruled by the French as a colony. And in 1954, the French finally leave. The Vietnamese kick them out. They fight a very long war. And the French leave. And the U.S. begins to kind of pick up the pieces, not sending in troops yet, but contributing money, advice to the South Vietnamese, who are, much like South Korea, a democracy. North Vietnam, the Viet Cong, led by a man named Ho Chi Minh, are aided and assisted by both China and the Soviet Union, because of course they want more communist nations on their side. So the United States will end up fighting alongside the South Vietnamese against the North Vietnamese. Now, what will begin to force American involvement won't happen until the early 1960s. What will happen is that after the French left, the Viet Cong, like I said, wanted to unite Vietnam as a communist nation. And because the South Vietnamese didn't want that, they keep fighting back. And because of the Truman Doctrine, the United States, again, contributes money, but then it becomes obvious money's not enough, that the South Vietnamese need more actual boots on the ground assistance to fight off the communists. And so the U.S. began by sending a few military advisors in the late 50s, but started sending more advisors in 61. Active combat units are finally introduced to Vietnam in 1965, and by 1969, 500,000 American soldiers are serving in Vietnam. And at the same time, the Soviets and China are pouring money into the Viet Cong. Now, the war is, as I'm sure many of you know, it's long, it's bloody, it's difficult, and the United States never really feels they have the upper hand. And there's the anti-war movement. A lot of people in the United States felt like they didn't really understand why we were there. And that's something that's still a bit contested today. Why were we in Vietnam? And the more the casualty rate rose, the more people asked that question. You also have the problems with the draft, where young men, when they turned 18, right, signed up for selective service for the draft, and then when your number was up, you had to serve. And so a lot of people didn't find that to be particularly fair, because a lot of times the wealthy were able to buy their way out of the draft, so that was frustrating. So there's a lot of discord in the United States during Vietnam over what the war's about, who's fighting it, and why we were there. And that definitely added to the stress of the situation. Now, in 1973, the United States finally pulls out under President Nixon, who realizes that this is not going to work. I mean, it takes him a while to realize that, but he finally realizes that the U.S. cannot win this war. And the American public's not on board. And in a democracy, you have to have the will of the people behind you. By the early 70s, 71% of Americans, and I promise I'm not pulling that statistic out of a hat, so roughly 71% of Americans did not think that we should be in Vietnam. And to get 71% of Americans to agree on much of anything, then as now, is a pretty big deal. So the U.S. leaves. They try to slowly leave. They try to train the South Vietnamese forces to defend themselves. But ultimately, in 1975, South Vietnam falls to North Vietnam, to the Viet Cong. And the country then becomes communist. In terms of casualties, this is incredibly costly. 2 million civilians die. 1.1 million of those are people who are North Vietnamese, part of the Viet Cong. And 250,000 of those are South Vietnamese civilians. The United States loses 57,939, so far less than World War II, but definitely a high number, especially when so many people were questioning the entire point of the war. Definitely made each of those deaths seem like perhaps they weren't necessary.